So yeah, this is the Outdoor Bouldering Strategies clinic. And I'm Carlo Traversi. I've been a professional climber for over 10 years now. I think actually 12 or 13 years. I've been climbing for 18 years. And I climb indoors, outdoors. I do trad, bouldering, sport, alpine, kind of the whole mix of everything. I just love to rock climb. And yeah, the purpose of this course is really just to introduce people to some strategies that would help them succeed while climbing outdoors. There's a lot of people that have kind of started climbing in gyms and, you know, haven't been outside very much, and they may not know a lot of the, you know, kind of tips and tricks for how to succeed in the best possible way outside, because outdoor bouldering is very, very different from indoor bouldering. You know, there's a lot of the same strengths and techniques and stuff like that, but there's just little tips and tricks that are super helpful for being successful as an outdoor boulderer. So the purpose of this is, you know, whether you've been climbing for a year or less, or, you know, even a couple of years, if you don't have a ton of experience climbing outside, or if you feel like you've, you know, struggled with certain aspects of climbing outside compared to what you're able to do in the gym. I just want to offer up as many tips and insights as I have, you know, accumulated over the years for people. So I've kind of broken it down into a couple different kind of sections, such as like selecting the right area and problems and routes to try, and then equipment needs, assessing the conditions, pad placement and spotting, and successfully utilizing the outdoor feet and holds, which can be very different from indoor. And then conserving skin and energy, and then a little bit about ethics as well. So that's kind of how I've broken it down. But I'm honestly like really looking forward to just having a good interaction between, you know, you guys and then other clinic participants as well, and just getting an understanding of like where everyone's at individually, and what they're looking to learn, and you know, where maybe they've struggled, or if they've noticed things outside that, you know, seem odd to them, and they just don't know how to, like, you know, how to figure it out, or, you know, just want some tips and tricks for how to climb better outside. So, but yeah, does anyone have any questions for me? I guess, you know, before any of this, is there any anything specifically that you're looking forward to learning throughout this, or yeah, anybody?
Carlo, are you able to see the people that are in the webinar?
Yeah, I see. I mean, I see people, I see like the names on Zoom here, but I only see probably 6 names total, I think, other than ours. So
Okay.
I don't know if I see like the full view that you guys have necessarily.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Also, feel free to put your videos on and interact and chat. Think of this as an in-person clinic as much as
Totally.
as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm psyched to meet people and meet all you guys that are here, and yeah, and share information for sure.
There's Face.
There's Face. How's it going, man? Cool. Do you have any questions before we get going? I think you're on mute, Manny. Manny, is it?
Mm-hmm. I can unmute him.
I think you're on mute, Manny. There we go.
Oh, okay, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably better after your presentation. My questions are pretty specific.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we can do it at the end then, for sure. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming.
Nice.
Cool. So I guess I'll launch into it. So the first thing that we can kind of go over is selecting the right area and routes and problems to try. I typically would recommend, you know, selecting areas kind of based on experience. If you have less experience as a climber, like say a year or less, I would recommend picking areas and routes with mostly low angle terrain and with easy descents. These can be easy to find information in guidebooks. Like obviously your first step is to kind of figure out what's around you. in terms of areas, and then, you know, pick up a guidebook or find somebody that kind of knows those areas that's local and that would be willing to take you out. And then finding zones that have some more low angle terrain, and descents can be something that you don't think about, especially if you've mostly climbed in the gym, because, you know, it's pretty easy to get down from a climbing wall in the gym. It's kind of set up that way. But outside, I've definitely, you know, not done my due diligence before and climbed boulders and not really figured out where to get down from. And then I'm on top and I'm like, I have no idea how to get off this thing. It can usually be helpful, obviously, if you have someone there to like look out for you and be able to kind of show you where to get down. But typically when I go out, I try and find, you know, especially early on, as I found areas that were either walk-offs or stuff that had really, really easy descents. And then I typically would recommend, if you're in Utah, the sandstone areas are typically a little bit easier to read the rock early on. So that would be my recommendation for people with less experience going from the gym to outdoors. So Joe's Valley sandstone, obviously, and I have found Joe's to be a fairly easy area to read the rock. So, and then if you have moderate experience climbing, like 1 to 3 years experience, I think you can start to kind of open up the amount of areas that you check out, and just look for areas that have a lot of variety. Even if you're, you know, have a decent amount of experience, it's good to pick zones, you know, that have a big range of problems, from really, really easy to, you know, to potentially some harder stuff that you can kind of test yourself out on. But making sure that you have, you know, zones that are, that have a good amount of warm-ups is something that I still look for. And, you know, even climbing at, you know, near the upper end of the scale. So, and then also kind of planning my day around, you know, going to an area that has more warm-ups first, and then kind of progressing to some zones that have some harder stuff that I want to try. And then even for experienced climbers, you know, if you've been climbing the gym for more than 3 years, but it's your first times outside, I would still recommend following a lot of these principles in terms of picking an area. But yeah, does anyone have any questions about that? Anything about picking a specific climbing area?
Do you remember what your first climbing area was?
Yeah, actually the first time I went out climbing was an area called Goat Rock on the California coast. And it was the closest rock to where I grew up in Santa Rosa. And it's really, really slick. It's called schist. And it's like a coastal schist, and it's got like, it's super polished. So I found it really, really hard to keep my feet on, and there's not very much texture. So it was really hard to kind of stick to the rock, and it just felt very foreign compared to the gym at the time. But I enjoyed it just because it was cool to climb on things that felt really like solid, and just like, I don't know, it just has like a grounding feeling to climb outside. So, but yeah, that was my first area that I climbed outside. But maybe it wasn't the easiest place to start learning too. The grades are particularly stiff there, I feel like. So, but how about you guys? First areas outside?
Oh, it looks like there's a question.
There
From
is a question. How to make? Yeah, so I climb in Rocky Mountain National Park a lot, and I was actually just there for the last month and a half or so. I would say that's a great area for kind of any ability levels. I would say that the guidebook hasn't covered a lot of the more moderate problems as much as it could, but there are still plenty of climbs to try in a more, you know, moderate range. I mean, I don't exactly know your skill level or your experience, but you know, even as a V4 boulderer, and V4 can be different. You know, it's like if you climb V4 in the gym, it can be different if you're outside. I've seen people that climb V4 in the gym actually climb better outside, depending on the area. But it can kind of go either way. I would say that the difficult aspect of Rocky Mountain National Park is the landings. You do need quite a bit of pads, especially if you're a newer climber. Because the landings are particularly rocky. It's most of the climbing there is in a talus field, or in talus fields. So the landings, you're mostly falling on rock and kind of jumbled boulders and stuff. There are some zones that have flat landings, and you can easily see what those are through the guidebook. But yeah, I think that everyone can excel there, but those are things to kind of be aware of. And if you're going with friends or you're going with other people, it'd be good. I would say as a a less experienced climber, going climbing there by yourself, you're probably not going to get the most out of it as you would maybe some other areas. Like I would say Joe's Valley is a pretty good area for climbing alone early on, because you can definitely find plenty of climbs that are pretty low to the ground and have flat landings and are easy to protect yourself. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case in Rocky Mountain. So, but it can be done. So for sure. And I hope that answers your question. And Asheboro boulders in North Carolina. Oh, cool. I have not been to the Asheboro boulders, but I've a bit in mine. I really enjoyed the rock there. It's super fun. So that's cool. That's awesome. Cool. So yeah, just some things to remember about selecting the area. Every area and different type of rock is going to feel very different. Just because you climb a certain grade in one area is not going to be the same at other areas. I've definitely, especially early on, found that certain zones were particularly stiffer than others. And it may not have had to do with the physical difficulty of it, but just the style of rock and the style of climbing was just something that was more foreign to me. So I grew up mostly climbing on granite in the Sierra in California. And I remember when I first started climbing on more sandstone or more limestone, particularly limestone, which I don't really get much of in California. I found it really difficult to start off with, and it took time to kind of get used to it. But that's one of the cool things about climbing, is that every area has its own kind of unique character and style to it. And it's probably one of my favorite things about going climbing, is that you can travel and go to these different zones that are completely new experiences. It would definitely be a lot more boring if every time you went climbing, it was kind of a similar feel and similar, kind of characteristics and stuff. So I've definitely, I've really enjoyed just kind of learning all the individual areas around the world even. So cool. So that should about cover it for selecting the right areas, routes, problems. Does anyone else have any other questions in regards to selecting zones? Cool. All right. So the next thing that I kind of want to move on towards is your equipment needs, depending on the area you're in, the problem, and then obviously, weather and the season. Your clothing obviously is really important. The factors that I look in for clothing are comfort, durability, warmth of your clothing when it's cold, and then moisture management when it's really hot, and then picking the right layers. Everyone's kind of got a good kind of system for what their needs are, so I won't dive into it on an individual level, but I typically, when it's hot, I'm usually in shorts and then like a really light t-shirt. I've been wearing a lot of like a wool or synthetic t-shirts during the summer lately, just because they dry out a little easier than cotton. And then during the winter, I just make sure I bring a lot of layers. And then particularly with bouldering, I like when it's really cold just to have like a giant down or puffy jacket that I can kind of put on between goes and just kind of take off, put on, take off, put on. And I found the down jacket's really helpful too for warming up your climbing shoes when it's really cold. You can stuff the jacket with your shoes and use your body heat to kind of warm up your shoes, because that's one thing that is not fun, is throwing on a pair of brick hard freezing cold shoes when you go outside climbing. So and then yeah, speaking of climbing shoes, you're definitely I think one of the more important parts of climbing shoes is comfort. I'd say the longer time you're going to spend in the shoes, the more comfortable and flat you want those shoes to be. If you're doing more, I know this is a bouldering clinic, but if you're doing more multi-pitch climbing, that's a long time in shoes, obviously. So you're going to want to have those shoes be most comfortable. If it's single pitch sport or trad, then, it's not a huge amount of time in shoes, but it can be up to, 45 minutes or half hour, depending on how long you're on that pitch, or working it and whatnot. So your shoes can be, not completely flat and just like comfortable. And then, obviously with bouldering, you're spending a pretty short time in your shoes. My bouldering shoes are definitely my tightest, most aggressive shoes. And I typically can't wear them for more than, 10, 20 minutes without having to kind of take them off and rest my feet. And find the tighter shoes just to be better for sensitivity and being able to stand easier on really, really small footholds. So that's kind of the reason why the shoes end up being really tight and uncomfortable, is because they typically perform slightly better in that way. Although I have found that, particularly in recent years, the shoe technology is getting to the point where you still have really, really technical and really advanced shoes that are really, really comfortable. So, but I think it's just important to just kind of know what your day of climbing is going to be and how long you're going to spend in those shoes. And then also the types of climbing terrain that you're going to be on. I would say I bring quite a few different pairs of shoes out when I go climbing. I usually have, one pair that's a little bit more comfortable that I can put on while I'm warming up, and then trying some easier climbs with bigger feet. And then I have, one pair that's got really, really stiff where I can stand on super, super small feet, and more vertical terrain. And then I usually bring out a pair that's a lot softer, that's good for overhanging roofs where you want to really toe in on kind of like bigger holds and bigger footholds. And so you can really kind of bend your foot and claw your way into those things. So I go bouldering with a variety of shoes, but it's not always easy to have like a huge variety of shoes, because shoes are expensive. So if you don't have the option to be able to have a couple different pairs for certain things, which, if you're early on in climbing, you probably don't need that, then I would try and pick a shoe that's somewhere in the moderate range, like not too flat, but not too aggressive. Something that's going to kind of help you get up, the biggest variety of problems possible. So I would say that sandstone is typically best with a more softer, sensitive shoe. And then I find that granite is typically best with a stiffer, slightly less sensitive shoe. At least that's what I've found. On granite, you're standing on really, really small chips, and you don't really want to feel everything. You don't want to feel every little nuance of it, because it's painful when you're standing on that small of a foothold. So I would recommend a stiffer shoe for granite. And then with limestone, another rock option, I think it's good with either option, either a stiff or soft shoe, and I think it's more about individual preference. But limestone typically tends to be slightly steeper, so I do find that people tend to go for a softer shoe for limestone. So does anyone have any questions about climbing shoe choices for climbing outside in particular? I have found that climbing outside compared to the gym, because you're dealing with a bigger variety of textures outside, your shoe choice is a little bit more specific based on what kind of terrain that you're on. Compared to the gym. I found that the gym I can typically climb decently well with most shoes, whether they're more of an entry-level shoe or a more aggressive shoe. I typically find that I do generally about the same, whereas outside, because the footholds are really different depending on the rock type, and they can also be, the footholds outside are typically much, much smaller than you'll find in the gym. I find that the shoe choices are much more important. So. But yeah, any questions about equipment in the outdoors?
I have a random question.
Yeah.
I like when I started bouldering, people were always like, "Oh, like never walk around with your shoes like on the dirt and stuff."
Totally.
But then I was in Bishop last year, and I saw a bunch of pros, just like walking around like all over the place, just in the dirt with their shoes on. I was kind of wondering What was up with
Totally.
that? I thought that was bad for the shoes.
I mean, people do it just because obviously they get lazy and they don't want to pull their shoes off.
Oh, nice.
I would recommend not walking around in your shoes too much. What it can do is that, you know, you have this basically this piece of cardboard or plastic that's built into the sole of the shoe that keeps the shoe stiff. That's not on every shoe. Obviously, really, really soft shoes don't have that. But a lot of shoes that you want to keep them really stiff, the more you walk around on them, it's going to break down that midsole of the shoe. And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not going to work in your
makes sense.
favor. So you may not be wearing out the shoe, but you kind of are in some ways. It's not the worst thing in the world, but your shoes are also going to get really dirty. And I'd say, you know, if you have to walk around in them in the dirt, that's fine. Just make sure you clean them off really well before you get back on the rock. You're trying to have like the least, you know, barrier between the rubber of the shoe and the rock, you know, to get the most friction out of it. So I think
Yeah,
you're right.
totally.
You know, they probably were not doing the right thing walking around in their shoes everywhere, but obviously it's
I
not
was
like
just curious. Yeah.
people can do whatever they want, you know. I wouldn't,
Yeah, totally.
but you know, what you're do if you're just kind of like in your comfy shoes, you're not too worried about it, and you're climbing on much easier terrain with big feet, it's not going to be the end of the world. So and I just saw a comment pop up. What's your all-time favorite climbing shoe? My favorite shoe is the 510 high angle. It's the shoe I've been using for the longest, and I've used it on the biggest variety of climbing terrain. I've climbed, you know, 514 trad in it. I've climbed Alpine Big Wall in the high angle, and, you know, I've bouldered V15 in it as well. So I've done the biggest variety of climbing out of that shoe. I've also competed in it for years in the gym. So I like a shoe that I can use, you know, really, really well on the biggest variety of terrain. So I found that one to be the best for me. But finding your shoe is going to be a lot about just individual preference and figuring out what fits your foot really well and just getting used to that shoe as well, you know. So it takes time. And then top 5 items you'd never be caught bouldering without. Well, obviously my shoes, my chalk bag, some amount of chalk. I always make sure I'm carrying a brush to be able to brush excess chalk off holds. It's typically a boar's hair brush, pretty soft bristles, so it doesn't damage the rock, but does a good job cleaning off, you know, chalk or sand or dirt or other things that are on it. And then I typically I usually have a roll of tape just in case I get a flapper or a split or something. And then I make sure that I usually always bring water because I can usually survive the day without food if I need to, but water's good to have so you're not getting dehydrated. You know, obviously getting dehydrated, you put yourself at a greater risk of injury. So particularly to tendons and stuff like that. So, and then what exercises do you integrate to stay in physical shape on a long trip? I'm not the best at this, I'm going to admit. I rely mostly on climbing and hiking to kind of stay in shape. I do some like, you know, kind of PT exercises with bands and stuff to warm up. And, you know, to make sure that I'm doing kind of exercises that activate muscles that I may be neglecting in the projects that I'm trying and stuff. But particularly during the summer months, I'm usually hiking a lot. Like if I'm going to Rocky Mountain National Park, I'm hiking, you know, 7 to 8 miles a day, which is a pretty good cardio workout. And then, you know, climbing, you know, 5 or 6 hours out of that day as well. But, you know, during the winter months, I do climb in the gym a little bit more. But I don't do a lot of, surprisingly, don't do a lot of exercises or training stuff, especially when I'm on outdoor trips. I try and keep the training to when I'm home. And then when I'm on outdoor trips, I use it as kind of like a resting time where I'm like trying projects outside, but then not killing myself, you know, like at night or, you know, on off days, and just trying to get the most rest I can. So, shoe brand for wider feet. You know, every shoe brand has shoes that are, you know, better for wider feet. I climb for 5'10", so my recommendations for wider feet for 5'10" are the Echelon as a newer shoe designed by Fred Nicole, and that has a much wider toe box than other shoes that I've tried from them. I've also used the Moccasin for a long time, which is a more comfortable, not entry level, I would say, but like it's a comfortable slipper that can be used on a big variety of terrain. And I found that to have a wider toe box than a lot of other shoes. But my best recommendation for that is just to find somewhere that has a lot of shoe options for you to try on and just figure out what fits best. So, cool. Let's move on then. Assessing the conditions. So this one, every climber kind of has their, idea of perfect conditions and what works best for them. I kind of have like a weird, over time have developed kind of like an odd, like relationship with weather and conditions and stuff. And I would say for me personally, my best bouldering conditions are like somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees and with like a light wind. What I've learned about myself as a climber is that I have really, really good circulation. And that works well for me in the winter months. My hands and feet basically never really get cold or numb, even in the coldest conditions, but that also doesn't work in my favor when it's really warm. So when it's super hot outside, like my hands are just sweating like crazy and I'm just sweaty and it sucks and I can't stick to anything. And I've just kind of had to learn to deal with warmer conditions in that way. And that's why I think a lot of the time in the summer months, I'm either trying to find the coldest conditions I can in the Alpine, or I'm just, just not trying stuff that's at my limit. I'm sticking to things that are a little bit easier and just trying to, keep climbing, but not pushing myself in a really, really hard way. Just because I know what I thrive in. But I also know a lot of climbers that, have really, really dry skin and they don't have good, good circulation. And during the summer months, they actually do a lot better because they have an easier time warming up because it's not freezing cold. And they're not sweating as much because the circulation's not the same thing. So they thrive, in warmer months. And I think it's good to just try and go and test yourself in a variety of different climates and figure out what works best for you and where you thrive. And then if you're looking at performing at your absolute peak outdoors, then, check the weather and make sure that it's going to kind of line up with where you find yourself performing performing the best. So, but yeah, it's all dependent upon, your body, your needs. And then I've also found that, the cold typically has better friction because your skin sticks better. And that's not just a sweat thing as well. It's when you build up a callus on your fingertips, the callus gets, hard when it's cold because there's less blood going through your hands. And I found that when it's really cold, that friction's better because that callus is actually sticking to the rock without rolling the callus off. So that's another factor of the friction, not just in relation to the sweat that's created when it's warm. It's just when it's colder, your hands are going to stick better to the rock just in general. But obviously, if it gets too cold and you can't feel anything, that's not going to help you either. They've also done studies on climbing shoe rubber, and they've found that climbing shoe rubber, the friction is much, much better on shoe rubber when it's a lot colder as well. So I would say that generally colder conditions are typically favorable for having the most friction. And but it also is dependent on the rock type. I find that sandstone doesn't matter quite as much, especially in areas like Joe's Valley when you have a lot of edges and in-cut things. And the holds are not super small. They're fairly large a lot of the time and have a lot of in-cut surface to them. But areas like Horsepens 40 or Fontainebleau in France, those are sandstone areas with a lot of slopers, and because there's not as many in-cuts, those areas are much harder to hold on to when it's hot. So it depends on the area and the type of rock. I've found that granite is particularly difficult to climb on when it's warm and when you're sweaty. I've found no real tricks to it. It's just hard when it's hot. And for me personally, I like granite when it's like in the 20 degree Fahrenheit range. And I feel like it starts to feel like Velcro at that point on my hands and feet. Whereas if you were to try and climb the same problems, you know, when it's 60 degrees out, you'd say it's impossible. And then you climb it when it's 40 and you're like, this is the easiest thing I've ever climbed. It's funny that way. But I'd say the biggest discrepancy for conditions and your performance is on granite, in my experience. But I would obviously recommend just testing it out and just seeing how it feels to you, and understanding what that feels like for your skin and your calluses, and just how you react to it as well. So, and then obviously the humidity has a is a big factor. And wind can help this. So if you check the forecast and you see a decent amount of wind, that can help cut the humidity down and keep your skin dry in any area. And then I'm always looking at the humidity levels in wherever I'm climbing, just to kind of understand what my needs are for the day. Obviously, if the humidity is super, super high, I'll bring some liquid chalk or something extra to kind of keep my hands dry, and just, accept that it's going to be a little bit, more wet feeling on the rock. But I have also found that in areas like Rocky Mountain National Park, it can actually be too dry, where you start rock. So those areas, they're under 15% humidity most of the time, because you're at 10,000 feet and it's typically a little bit windy. And I actually wet my hands before I get on the wall there, because I'll get a few moves in and I'll start to dry fire off the rock, which is basically where the hands get too dry and the rock is really glassy or doesn't have enough texture to grip into the callus, and you'll just slide right off the wall. So I found that, I would soak my hands in a little bit of water and then let it dry a little bit so that it's still kind of damp. And then I would chalk up on slightly damp hands. And I found that to actually provide better friction in really dry alpine environments. So we call it the sticky damp. So it's kind of a little trick that we use in those zones that can be really helpful. So does anyone have any questions about I guess conditions, or temperatures, or anything regarding the weather?
Is the Makita fan just an integral part of the bouldering kit nowadays?
The Makita fan, yeah. I actually have a Milwaukee fan, but yeah.
Nice.
The portable battery powered fan is definitely become a part of the arsenal. I don't typically
Nice.
bring it out if I have to hike more than, say, like a mile, just because they're pretty heavy. But I found a project that absolutely needed it, that was, way in the woods. I would probably still take it. It does
Nice.
a lot. It does. I've even rigged up the fan to like be pointed at, crux holds and stuff like that to keep them dry, and tried a variety of things. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times where I'm finding that I'm not able to climb as well because I don't have that sending breeze. And, with the battery powered fan, you can bring your send breeze with you. So,
And do you
yeah.
use that like when you're climbing as well, or do you kind of just use it before you're climbing on your hands and on the holds and stuff?
It typically doesn't move around air enough to be useful while you're climbing. I've seen people kind of hold the fan up like with you while you're climbing, and that can be helpful. But yeah, I typically would use it mainly to like in between goes to like keep my hands dry. And it keeps them colder as well, when it's warmer. And I've just found it's not like the fix all for conditions, but what I will say is that, say it's 5 or 10 degrees, a little bit too warm for what your optimal would be. It can help. It can help with that, and it can kind of take the edge off of that heat. So I don't think it's necessary for, like if you're grabbing holds that are fairly big and like, you're not trying super, super hard stuff. I don't think it's as necessary, but as holds get more smaller and more specific, and, your skin becomes really, really important, and like the friction becomes super, super important, then the fan can kind of be added into the mix for sure. So,
Nice. Yeah, I think I got to get one of those.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's nice to have. It is, absolutely.
Yeah. Nice.
So other skincare steps. I mean, a lot of people would say, trying to keep your hands dry all the time is the best way to do it. And I knew for a lot of years, I knew a lot of friends of professional climbers that wouldn't take wouldn't get their hands wet in the shower and wouldn't do dishes and stuff like that. I have never been of that methodology. I wash my hands all the time, and I've found that, keeping your hands somewhat hydrated and moist, between climbing sessions actually does a better job of keeping your skin healthier and thicker. And then just making sure that, you have enough time to kind of dry your skin out before you start climbing. But, like I talked about with the Rocky Mountain National Park stuff, too dry a skin isn't a good thing either. You're going to get more splits. You're going to find yourself, ripping more flappers off because your skin's too dry. So it's kind of up to you to find your right balance with your skin, how your skin reacts to things. And everyone's got kind of a different moisture level there. But I haven't found any real reason to like dry my hands out permanently for better climbing. There's obviously a bunch of skincare products that are out there that are useful. Climb On makes skin products. Rhino makes skin products. There's Climb Skin Spain. I mean, there's a huge range of products out there. I've tried a lot of them, and I do use them occasionally. I use a variety of them. But to be honest, I haven't found one that was just like, this is like the gold standard and fixes everything for me. Really, when your skin gets beat up, it's just time. A lot of it is just waiting for it to kind of grow back and repair itself. Your body has those mechanisms built in, and it typically does a pretty good job. So, cool. Any other questions about conditions and stuff? Sweet. All right, let's move into pad placement and spotting. So, proper pad placement while you're bouldering is really important, because obviously in the gym, you've got this giant floor underneath you, and it doesn't really matter. You're pretty much always going to land on a padded surface no matter what in the gym. And that can lead you to kind of this kind of false sense of security, especially when you're climbing outside. I've seen people that have first gone outside and their awareness of where the pads are just isn't great. And this can be super detrimental to, even just small falls. You could take a fall off of a 2-3 foot climb and sprain an ankle really easily just by hitting an uneven surface or a rock or, something that is in the way. So when I approach a boulder, I'm always just assessing the landing first, seeing how flat it is, what kind of terrain it is, how tall the climb is, how many pads I think I'm going to need to cover that terrain. If you have more people with you, then you'll typically have more pads, but oddly enough, you don't need as many pads when you have more people with you, because it's easier for them to move those pads for you. So if you're by yourself, you need to be able to cover any potential terrain that you're going to fall in, because you don't have anyone to move stuff around or keep you on those pads like a spotter. But if you're with other climbers, then they can easily slide pads around and make sure that they're under you the whole time. But with, really, really rocky terrain, like, in Rocky Mountain National Park with a lot of talus, it's also hard to move pads because stuff gets caught. You catch the backpack straps, you catch the straps in between rocks. It's also like you may move a pad and then realize that where you moved it is super uneven and not a really great place to have a pad anyways. So there's a lot of factors involved with, proper pad placement. But yeah, first I would essentially just say, assess the terrain. The first type of terrain would just be flat dirt or sand. This is typically pretty easy to protect, just because if you miss a pad in dirt or sand, you're probably not going to injure yourself unless you're falling from a pretty far height. But then, it's also really easy to lay pads out kind of wherever you want and have to worry about rocks jutting up or filling, holes or gaps or things. So the next most difficult would be, flat rock. Pretty easy to lay your pads down here because it's flat, but if you miss a pad, it's going to be, it's not going to be good, because even if you fall from a couple feet up onto flat rock, you have a good chance of, bruising a heel or spraining an ankle or a variety of other things. And then you kind of progress into more of a mix of dirt and rock, or just really rocky and uneven terrain. And then the most difficult, as I said, is probably talus, just because it's rock, which means that any landing in it is probably going to injure you. And then because it's extremely uneven, like talus is, you're never really going to land on a flat surface most of the time. You're always going to have to adapt to landing in kind of an awkward position. And this is where, you know, spotters and pad placement is the most potential, the most important. But as far as putting pads down, I typically, I try and, with the more uneven terrain, I try and, you know, fill gaps first. So look at where I'm going to land on that problem and then try and fill the gaps. So if there's like 2 rocks here and here, then I'll put a pad kind of in between them to kind of like make up the gap space, and then put pads over the top of all of that to kind of flatten the whole surface out. Another thing that you're not going to want to have is, you know, pads that are overlapping too much, because then you're going to create your own uneven surface. So the best surface that you can land on is the most flat surface possible, and you know, something where you're not going to be at risk of spraining an ankle. And then also, you know, making sure that there's no gap between the pads. And this is something that's really easy to forget while you're climbing outside, is you may set up the landing perfectly, but every fall the landing's going to kind of slowly move away and kind of like start to deteriorate. And just have to constantly be maintaining that landing surface and keeping the pads together. So that I've seen a lot of people sprain ankles because they just kind of forgot about this gap that was forming between the pads, and it didn't look like a big deal. And then they fell and their foot went between the gap of the pads, and they sprained an ankle or hit a rock maybe that was hiding in there. So those are all important steps. Obviously, more pads the better, but I've also seen people with a ton of pads create terrible landings because they stack the pads up too high, and then someone hits the edge of that stack of pads because it's not flat. So it's not having a bunch of pads isn't necessarily like a fix-all to a good landing. You also have to make sure that you know how to kind of architect a good flat landing surface. And then if you're stacking, the other point that I'll make is if you're stacking multiple layers of pads, I recommend making sure the gaps are offset so that the gaps aren't consistent. So obviously if you have one set that's like this, and then you put another set directly on top where the gap is in the same place, then you could easily fall through both layers of foam through that gap. So I would recommend offsetting that gap so that even if you fall through the gap on the upper layer, you're going to hit a solid pad on the next layer down. So when I'm building a landing zone, that's you know, some of the things that I'm paying attention to. So you guys have any questions about pads and pad setups? The other thing that I would mention as well is if you show up to a boulder where there's a lot of people climbing and you see that their pad setup is really poor, don't feel bad, you know, just asking them if you can rearrange and kind of help move things around, as long as you kind of know where everyone's climbing and what people are climbing on. It's much better to kind of be that person that kind of points that out or is willing to fix those things than to have somebody or you sprain an ankle or injure yourself because of someone else's poor pad setup. I've found that people can be really lazy about setting up their pads and keeping that landing area maintained. And especially when you're in a zone with a ton of people climbing, it can, and with a lot of foam, it can just feel kind of like, oh, whatever, there's a ton of pads here, it'll be okay. But I've seen some of the worst injuries happen in those areas just because people tend to be a little bit too comfortable. So cool. Sweet. Let's move into spotting. This one's pretty simple. I typically don't recommend spotting much in the gym just because you're always landing on a padded surface. The only time spotting in the gym is really helpful is if, like, you know, your feet are really far above your head and you need to make sure you're not going to land on your back or your neck or something. Outdoors outdoors spotting is far more important because the landing area isn't as extensive as it is in the gym. And spotting outdoors is really just making sure that people are landing on their feet on the pads. So I typically, as a spotter, kind of orient myself around the edge of the pads. And this kind of creates like a natural barrier, as if someone comes close to me, I can be there to kind of push off and make sure that they land on the padded area. my first priority is to make sure that they just land on the foam. And then second priority typically is that, you know, they land on their feet as much as possible. But, you know, it's similar to the gym. A lot of times people land on their feet and then kind of roll to the side or roll backwards to absorb that force. And that can be something to pay attention to as well, is that even though they're going to fall and land on their feet on the foam, you want to watch out for if that fall was big enough that they may roll off the pad to try and support them if they feel like they're going to fall off of it. So the other thing I want to mention about spotting is that it's not your job to catch somebody as they're falling. I've seen a ton of injuries from people trying to actually catch somebody out of the air. And you'll catch a stray elbow. My brother actually fractured his eye socket from someone putting an elbow into his face. And I've seen some really bad injuries to the climber from that as well, because the spotter may be too close and try and catch you and they misjudge the fall, and then your leg ends up on their shoulder and you flip upside down and land on your head. And it's just best to kind of stay off of the padded area and not try and catch somebody, but really just to keep them over the foam as much as you can. But it's ultimately up to them as a climber to put themselves in a situation outside where they're going to land, you know, in a safe way too. So it's not just your responsibility as the spotter to keep them safe. It's their responsibility as well. So, but that's kind of it for spotting. I would say it's not super complicated, but it's just important to be aware of those things. Does anyone have any spotting questions? Cool. All right. So we've got what, about 10, 15 minutes here. Let's go into utilizing outdoor feet and holds. I would say this is obviously dependent, like we've talked about with different rock types, starting with sandstone. Sandstone typically has much bigger feet and bigger features on it, but there are less options. It's typically, I've found that sandstone will have like a big feature set or a big rail or a big edge, and then in between those features, it's fairly smooth. So you're going to be doing a lot of smearing and then also utilizing much bigger foot options. And the difference, I'd say it's similar to indoor climbing in that way. Sandstone is, because, you know, indoor you've got the holds that are bolted on to the climb that you're trying, and then it's basically smooth in between. So there's not a lot of other options for you to utilize. And you do a decent amount of smearing in the gym and then putting your feet on typically bigger holds. The difference from indoor climbing with sandstone is that it can be kind of sandy outside. There can be a layer of kind of sand and dirt on stuff that may not be apparent until you start really trying to stand on it. So brushing the holds and making sure they stay clean, and then making sure your feet stay clean is important to being able to stand properly and utilize sandstone as best as possible. For using sandstone holds, I'd say it's best to kind of focus on the most in-cut aspect of those holds. And generally it's pretty easy to assess where the best part of a hold is on sandstone, because you can kind of see it from the ground a lot of the time. And there's not a lot of like subtlety to where you hold it, or at least as much as there is on granite or limestone, potentially. The one, I'd say the one kind of difference there is, you know, obviously on sandstone slopers, there could be, you know, a little bit more specifics about exact positioning and stuff like that. But I would say that granite still is a little bit more specific. So granite has the biggest variety of foothold sizes and biggest variety of kind of hold sizes in general. The great thing about granite is that there's always a ton of options. What I found on granite is that most of the time there's a lot of footholds everywhere, but these footholds tend to be really small. So you do have to be more comfortable using really tiny feet. But the nice thing is, if you're a shorter climber, or if is that you have a bigger variety of things to kind of utilize, and a lot more variety to pick things that are going to work for you to be able to do moves easier. But I will say that granite can be a little bit trickier to hold on to compared to sandstone or limestone holds, because you have to really feel out the holds to be able to figure out the best way to grab them. I've definitely seen granite holds and been like, oh yeah, it looks like I grab it right here. And then when you finally grab it, you kind of have to feel around to try and find like the exact right position for it, to make it, you know, your skin sits in the little creases and the little crystals. It sits on them differently with granite as compared to other rock types. And then with limestone, it's your kind of biggest variety of different holds, and you end up getting a lot more pockets on limestone, which is, you know, just it's a little bit harder to get your feet in pockets later on, depending on the size of the pocket. And it can be a little harder to kind of see pockets while you're climbing. So pointing those out when you're on the ground can be helpful. And then also limestone can be a lot sharper than other rock. I've found a lot of really sharp edges on limestone, on the edge of pockets, or just, you know, just on like surfaces that you wouldn't expect to be, but has like really, really sharp kind of razor edges. But I would say that there can be a lot of really smooth surfaces of limestone as well. And limestone I've found to be probably the hardest rock to smear on. It just doesn't bite into the shoe in the same way on its really smooth surfaces, but it depends on, you know, where the limestone is and you know, what the qualities of that specific rock type are, because there's a lot of different types of limestone. So, but that basically covers it for utilizing outdoor feet holds. Obviously, we could go a lot more into depth about each of these, but trying to keep it as with time as general as possible. But does anyone have any specific questions about, you know, best utilizing, you know, outdoor feet and hand holds? Cool. I guess I covered all of it then. Sweet. Conserving skin and energy. We went over this a little bit, but I would say another thing to think about when you're trying to conserve skin and energy outside is that it's more abrasive than indoor holds, and your skin is going to take more of a beating. I try and strategize my efforts a little bit better when I'm climbing outside. Instead of trying every attempt from the bottom, I will typically work out individual moves. And then, you know, once I've learned each of those moves, I'll try from the bottom after I've done that, just so that, you know, you're not repeating a bunch of moves that are tearing skin away that you already know and you already have figured out just to fall on a move that you haven't solved yet. So that can be one way of strategizing and getting the most out of your day. And then also just paying attention to where your skin's at throughout the day. You know, how much skin have I, you know, worn off? If the temperatures are really warm, you're going to wear off a lot more skin than when the temperatures are really cold. So, you know, if it's the middle of the day and it's super hot and the rock's in the sun, sometimes I'll just wait to climb when it's colder, because I'll know I'll get more climbing out of the day. And it's a part of the strategy as well. And then maintaining skin, the thicker your skin is, it'll last longer because there's a bigger barrier from sweat. So the bigger callus you have, it's a barrier from that sweat coming out of your skin. So as your skin thins out over the course of the day, you're going to sweat more from your fingers, which is also going to make your skin wear away even faster. So it's kind of like it always seems like, you know, your skin's really good through the start of the day, and then all of a sudden it kind of starts getting bad, and then it quickly just deteriorates into like bleeding everything, and you're just like, I'm done, I'm out of here. So some ways of maintaining skin are sanding, using sandpaper to kind of sand off imperfections or little cuts and stuff. If you get a little flapper, it's usually best to clip it and then sand it down. If it's really deep and bleeding, obviously that's not something you want to do immediately. I would typically cover it, clean it out, wait a day, and then clip off the skin that's there, and then you can start sanding it once it starts to regrow some skin over the hole. And then, yeah, mainly just conservation, just figuring out how to conserve skin as best as possible throughout the day, and make sure that your efforts are worth it. You're not giving efforts that are not a full good effort, because you're losing skin every time you try and every time you pull on the wall. So cool. Does anyone have any questions about conserving skin and energy?
If I found that I rarely actually like end up sending boulders after like the first 45 minutes of trying them, even though I feel like I can give like good goes into like 2 or 3 hours. So I
Yeah.
was wondering if how you kind of think of that, like if you think it's unlikely that you're gonna send, do you kind of just like stop trying maybe if I'm on like a longer trip, or do you kind of like keep trying because you might figure out like some new beta, or yeah, mostly just figuring out new beta if you keep trying.
Totally. And I think you kind of hit on it there. It's really just like, it's always like a risk worth reward type of thing. When I go into strategizing outdoor climbing, it's like you're risking that you're going to be more tired when you come back to this, or you're risking that you're going to be more tired for the next day of climbing by giving more and more efforts. But if you feel like you have more to learn that day, or you feel like there's more you can kind of take in that session, then it may be worth it to give it those few other tries. But if you're just trying the same thing over and over again and you not feel like you're really getting anything more out of it, then the risk is probably not worth what you're achieving from it. So I'm always kind of going through a risk worth reward in my head of like, if tomorrow's for sure a rest day because the weather's bad, it's going to rain or something, then I'll give everything I got to that day, just because I'll see it as like a training day, or like I'm not conserving something for the next day or whatever. But obviously, you don't want to like rip your skin open and split yourself to the point where you can't climb for a couple days, So you're always kind of like trying to weigh those options and try and strategize those options as best as possible. And it really just depends on what you're climbing on and what your long-term goal is there.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm definitely always kind of monitoring that. I think that rehearsing the same moves over and over again can be really good for muscle memory. But obviously you don't need to do that like a bunch of times if it's ripping your skin to shreds, but I'd say if you're struggling to finish things towards the end of the day, then maybe you're not giving yourself enough rest between tries. And maybe you should wait until either the conditions get better, if you think they are going to get better, or just giving yourself, like, I'll work on something for a while and then give myself, a 30, 45 minute break, eat some food, walk around a little bit, just try and take my mind off of it, and then come back, re-warm up and try and kind of restart the session again and see how I feel.
Yeah.
But it's also dependent upon what you're climbing on too. So you'll be like, okay, I'm kind of feeling like I'm going to be toast for the rest of the day. And that's it. But what you're trying to do is prepare yourself as best as possible for that first hour of the session, the next session. So like, even if the end of that session feels like you're not going to finish it, you can at least be like, okay, what do I need to learn and what do I need to progress on so that when I come back to this, I can be successful in that first 45 minutes or first hour of the session next time. And that's typically how
Maybe
it
like do
goes.
the top out or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do the top out again. So, you make sure you're not going to fall off that or mess it up. And then, just rehearse the movement a little bit more so that you kind of know what you're going to do. But obviously don't do it to the point where you feel like you're going to, sacrifice too much skin or energy for the next session. So,
And when you said re-warm up, do you re-warm up with like a tension block or like doing some of the other moves again, or?
it depends. So if the rock is really sharp and I feel like I'm going to destroy my skin by warming up on the rock and there's not a lot of warm up options, then I'll use a tension board or like a, portable wood board. And that can be a good way of getting things going. If there are good warm up options, then I'll typically take advantage of climbing on the rock just to kind of get a feel for movement and stuff like that. Because obviously those boards and blocks, they'll warm up your hands, but they're not going to warm up your whole body and muscles and stuff. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
Nice.
if the rock's really sharp or you don't have a lot of options, then the boards are great for that. But I think if you do have good options, then I would recommend maybe starting with the boards a little bit and then doing a couple laps on some really easy, comfortable climbs nearby.
Nice.
Cool. And then the last thing I wanted to go over is just some basic ethics. For climbing outside, it's a little bit different than climbing in the gym. Just want to recommend just being courteous and considerate to other climbers that are out there. They're trying to experience those areas in the most pristine way possible. Same as, you or I are trying to do that. I don't recommend bringing loud music out unless I honestly don't recommend having like an outdoor speaker pretty much anytime out climbing. Obviously people do it when they're off in the middle of nowhere and there's no one else around and stuff like that. But I think that that's easy to kind of see that you're not affecting somebody else's experience in that way. Stay on marked trails whenever possible to decrease erosion. Keep your gear and personal items contained and in the smallest area possible so that you're not just a giant junk show at the crag. Don't alter the rock in any way. Chipping and gluing are not allowed and acceptable. So only using like a boar's hair brush or a natural bristled brush or even a nylon brush is typically you're really the only way you want to clean rock. On really, really hard rock types, you can use a wire, but you got to be really careful with it. And then, yeah, practicing leave no trace, and then making sure you leave an area the way you found it, making sure you brush your tick marks, removing large amounts of chalk that you might have left on the rock, cleaning up the top out a little bit if you chalked a bunch of stuff on the top out. It's always a bummer showing up to a wall and just seeing it like covered in ticks, you know, and you have to go through and kind of like brush stuff and tick things the way you want it. And I'm not opposed to ticks at all. I use tick marks, just making sure that you erase them when you're gone. So, but that about covers it. There's obviously a lot more outdoor ethics that we can dive into, but I think that covers the basics of it. So, but yeah, just any other, you know, questions you guys have?
I had a specific question about Boulder and Tahoe, actually.
Yeah, for sure. What's up?
So I went to Austere to kind of find it. And is it just like a massive hike, or is there like some secret approach beta? Like, do you approach it from the Emerald campground, and it's just like 2.5 hours?
Yeah.
Or oh, nice.
Yeah, it's a big hike. It's a massive hike. Yeah. Did you make it there or?
Yeah, we ended up finding it. We kind of like went on the main trail and then like backtracked in. Is that kind of how you approach it as well?
Yeah, there's no trail to that lake in that area.
Found,
so yeah, I typically am on the main trail for as long as possible, and then I just cut off into the woods at one point to get down to the lake. And then with that one, I specifically tried to stay on rock as much as possible to not basically be creating a trail through the woods. And it's actually easier to hike up there on the rocky terrain because, you know, there's less like meandering through the woods. You can kind of just find a rock surface and kind of blast through. But yeah, it's not an easy hike and it's not an easy boulder to find. So good on you for getting there. It is a long hike.
Yeah, we found it.
It is a long hike.
I was wondering if you had any recommendations for like climbing hard after like such a long hike like that. Cause I got there and I was like, damn, if I was climbing right now, that would be gnarly.
Just wrecked. Yeah. Hiking more. And more used to hiking long distances. Like when I'm climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park, I'm hiking, you know, if I go to upper Chaos Canyon, I'm hiking 4 miles one way, and I'm definitely wrecked when I get there. But I just plan to like hike. I get there. I usually don't climb for 30 minutes, 40 minutes after I get there at all. I'll usually drink water, eat. Sometimes I'll take like a small nap just to kind of like reset, you know, and just kind of relax and let, you know, let everything just kind of calm down and then start to warm up after that, get some blood in your arms and things. But it's just getting used to it. You'll get used to it, you know, like it feels pretty shitty, especially when you don't know where you're going and it's your first time.
Yeah.
I think you'll find that the more times you hike up there and the more times you kind of, you get out on bigger hikes, you're just going to find it easier to climb after that. But it isn't easy. It's definitely a part of the experience, you know, and it's a part of why those boulders that are, you know, way off the trail are a lot harder to do. So
nice. Yeah, I'm super stoked on that one.
Nice. That's awesome, man. I'm glad.
Yeah, it looks super good.
Yeah, it's a great one for sure.
Nice.
Cool. Any other questions? Everyone else is pretty quiet. That's okay too. I think we're a little bit past time. So awesome. Well, thanks guys. I hope that was informative and you guys got all the information that you needed. That was fun. So, and yeah, appreciate all the questions and stuff like that. So good luck in all of your outdoor bouldering pursuits. And for any of you guys that are there in Joe's Valley, enjoy. So, and thanks guys.
Thank you.
Yep. And I'm going to sign off. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good one.